We live in an Ice Age world and have been so for several million years. We have measured evidence that for 85% of the last 500,000 years, the Earth has been a virtual ice planet, with a climate so cold that the lands outside the tropics become essentially uninhabitable for human populations, and the lands within the tropics become uninhabitable for the lack of water. This means that what we regard as our normal climate is actually an anomaly that makes up only 15% of the overall time frame. The climate anomalies interrupt the normal glaciation climate in roughly 100,000-year intervals, with nicely warm interglacial holidays, like the one that we presently enjoy, a period of easy living with a strong sun and plenty of rain for agriculture. This means that for long times in between the interglacial holidays, the entire Earth is largely uninhabitable by today's standard. Numerous measurable forms of evidence tell us that we are about to get back to that. It tells us that our current warm interglacial climate, our holiday, is fast drawing to a close, and with it our living on Earth is drawing to a close unless we build the infrastructures for continued human living on an ice planet Earth. The principles of the universe do not fail. The Ice Age does not fail to resume by its principles. Neither should we fail to respond to its challenge, because no doom awaits us then. The challenge is to create us a secure platform for our continued living on this planet. To fail in this endeavor is not an option. It is not an option for humanity to choose not to have a future. To choose our near extinction by failing to respond to the needs of the future is not a valid option. Failure is not an option here either, and yet we, humanity, intend to fail. We are a mere 30 years away from the entire planet becoming uninhabitable, past the phase shift to the next Ice Age glaciation period. We know this. But in total defiance of this knowledge, we play silly games as children would. Games of nuclear war weapons politics, games of regime change wars, and of food burning in a starving world. Our commitment is to follow this recipe of failure. This is what we cannot afford. The evidence tells us that the next glaciation period will potentially begin sometime in the 2050s time frame, or sooner. Why is humanity so staunchly not responding to the absolute greatest danger in the entire history of its civilization? At that time the Earth reverts back to being an ice planet, as it has been for 85% of the last million years. The associated consequences will bear down on human living without fail. Should we choose not to be prepared for the consequences, as is presently the case, we would choose suicide by default. The Ice Age consequences are enormous. They have never before been experienced in all the history of civilization, nor are they imaginable. It is unimaginable that Canada, Europe, and Russia will become uninhabitable by intense cold, snow, and ice in 30 years, simultaneously, as will all the places outside the pink zone. It is likewise unimaginable that the rest of the world will become uninhabitable too, as it loses 80% of its rain. That's when the coach becomes a pumpkin, as in the Cinderella story. Society presently turns away from its future and shrugs. Atlas shrugs. The giant that humanity is shrugs. Instead of putting the spade in the ground to build a new world for itself that is fit for human living on an Ice Age planet. Humanity is presently asleep. It is dreaming of global warming, endless summers, the glory of war, profits from slavery, power by terror and corruption. The dreams that the systems of empire has prescribed for society like a drug. This dreaming is what society imagines determines its future. In this dreamland, the boundary blurs between fiction and reality. Reality becomes fiction, and fiction reality. We even educate our children with fairy tales. We tell them that the coach becoming a pumpkin at the stroke of midnight will never happen in reality. The opposite is true, isn't it? When markets crash, lies are exposed, governments fall, bubbles burst, illusions evaporate. The sky castles of dreams end up to be but a pumpkin. The glory of the endless interglacial holiday is one of those dreams. When children grow up, we teach them in the universities how to build investment portfolios that never collapse. But in the real world, they soon discover that their investment becomes somebody else's profit in a rigged game in which they all but a few end up with empty bags. We teach the children that financial speculation builds economic stability. War creates security. Democracy assures prosperity. And that the Apollo moon landings have been just Hollywood productions. We even say that Osama bin Laden had orchestrated the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York successfully, right in the midst of the most defended airspace in the world, all single-handed from a cave in Afghanistan. We teach our children and one another too the dreams that we like them to have. Daydreams of golden coaches, including that the sun isn't what it really is. Modern society loves to be entertained with fairy tales. In this context, the Ice Age is a forbidden subject. Reality is forbidden. Evidence is forbidden. Most people are carefully taught not to believe in evidence anyway, but to believe in their dreams with strong confidence and unshakable convictions. That's the modern landscape. That's why the most thoroughly educated people still believe in the hydrogen sun. Some even believe that the ice ages are caused by orbital cycles. Some believe in CO2 global warming obediently. Some also believe in winning the lottery. Some people even believe in Adolf Hitler, who is long dead, and in Wall Street that is nearly dead, and in nuclear war by which everyone will be dead if it comes to that. But when it comes to the Ice Age glaciation starting anew, and its deep consequences that no one can escape from, society shrugs. People say that the Ice Age is esoteric stuff that nobody believes in or ever would. No university teaches anything real on the most critical subject in the world that everyone is affected by. Indeed, they wouldn't dare to teach what is real, even if they knew it, because reality is a forbidden subject. No university dares to acknowledge what the most advanced science discoveries have laid onto the table. Society is protected from the discovered reality because by exposing it, empires would fall. But some people do dare to break the shell. Some dare to dance on the waters that all others avoid. Some dare to say that we can do what it takes to face reality and win, even if this seems impossible. Just imagine that universities would dare to acknowledge the Ice Age reality, such as that the entire planet becomes uninhabitable in 30 years' time, unless the technological infrastructures are built to make our future ice planet a livable world for 7 billion people and a lot more, by living on the sea along the equator. That's unheard of. Can you imagine further the consequences for empire when reality would be acknowledged and for the societies it controls? All the dreams and beliefs of much of the world would go out of the window when reality would be acknowledged. The world would become transformed by people daring to live outside the cage. A new age would begin, an age of defiance, an age without empires, wars, nuclear warfare, and a whole lot more. The changes in the world would be so extensive and would be so revolutionary that no one has had the courage yet to turn the page from tradition and cultivated impotence to reality. The conflict between reality and prescribed perceptions apparently is not a new phenomenon. The conflict goes back in time a long way, though on a smaller scale than today's. Way back in time, somebody had written an allegory about a great challenge. The challenge is focused on merely saving a city from the consequences of its folly, not the entire world. The story was written in early times and had apparently been judged so important because of events at the time that it had become one of the books of the Christian Bible. I am referring to the book of Jonah. The allegory is the story of a man named Jonah, who was ordered by God to go to a certain great city, but evil city, the city of Nineveh, and wake the people up there, because the city is in great danger on the course it is on. Of course, Jonah is afraid. The task looms enormously large. Nor is it to his liking to save a notoriously evil city. Jonah decides to solve his problem by escaping to a faraway place. He buys passage on a ship bound for Tarsus, a long distance away from Nineveh. But God doesn't let him off the hook. God casts a great storm upon the sea, so much so that the ship is about to be broken. When Jonah realizes for whose fault those many people in the ship were about to perish, he requests the shipmates to throw him overboard in order that the ship would be saved and their life with it. As the shipmates comply, reluctantly, as we are told, the storm does indeed cease. But God doesn't let Jonah off the hook with this attempted self-sacrifice either. He prepares a great fish that swallows up Jonah and deposits him onto the land. Are you now ready to go to Nineveh to wake everybody up? God asks him. This time Jonah complies and goes to the city. He goes to the city and warns the people within it as he is told. To his surprise, he finds the city responding to his words and repenting. Thus, the evil city is saved. Of course, Jonah doesn't like the outcome of an evil city being spared its doom. Jonah leaves the city and builds himself a shelter outside of it, from which to observe what might yet happen to the city. Might it yet be destroyed? He combles his displeasures before God, saying that he would rather die than see an evil city escape its vengeance due. In order to console him, God creates a gourd that gives him shelter from the sun while he sits and waits. Jonah is pleased with it. But on the next day, God creates a worm that kills the gourd and stirs a dry east wind that causes the gourd to wither away. Jonah responds angrily. He responds with sadness for the gourd. God asks him, how it is that he grieves for a god, but has no concern about the fate of an entire city of people. There may have been 100,000 to 150,000 living in the city of Nineveh at that time. God may have also urged him to go back into the city, because a great feast would await him there if he did. A feast for the heart. A city of once small-minded people waking up to what it means to be a human being. The Jonah story in the Bible doesn't have this ending included, though it appears to be implied. God also may have said to Jonah in the beginning that he had a great feast in store for him in Nineveh. Perhaps if Jonah had realized how great a feast for the heart he had been invited to be a part of, he might not have tried to run away from the task to bring it about. The story, as any well-written allegory, sets a mirror before us. Most people regard the Ice Age challenge, which they do not understand, if they regard it at all, as a foreboding of doom that he would rather run away from, instead of seeing it in terms of a great feast of good which it offers to humanity. Society today is like Nineveh was. It was awash with systems of empire and the corresponding evil of small-minded thinking, in which society is barely alive. But there is this potential in the air for a great feast of good unfolding, should humanity wake up from its slumber and morbid dreaming. The Ice Age challenge would be seen as a bugle call for humanity to wake up to its inherent potential by which it really lives. The feast for the heart, which is called for in the Ice Age case, involves the building of a completely new world with a highly elevated platform for living. For example, the Ice Age imperatives requires humanity to build itself 6,000 completely new cities for 1 million people each. They would need to be built afloat across the equatorial seas. This huge infrastructure could be manufactured with such ease in automated industrial processes that all the houses, as infrastructures for living, would be provided by society to one another for free, as an investment by society into the greatest asset that a society has, which is itself. The resulting world would be debt-free, poverty-free, rent-free, spacious, and be of the highest quality. It would include whatever is required to maximize the development of the human potential. It would be a feast for the heart indeed. The feast would revolutionize finance, economics, politics, cooperation, and human living. All the farming associated with the new floating cities would be done in scientifically optimized indoor facilities, operating with enhanced sunlight, enhanced atmosphere, and fresh water flowing directly out of the oceans by means of deep ocean reverse osmosis desalination. And this would be just the beginning. It would revolutionize construction, industrialization, and even energy systems. Once humanity pulls itself out of the small-minded world into the real world, all limits simply fall away. Imagine free healthcare, free education, free food, free housing, free transportation. In short, debt-free living. This is the potential that we need to awaken ourselves up to. It is a potential that is powered by our love for one another as human beings. There are many ways to be small-minded, and there are many ways to awake from the small-minded dream and come to life again. This happens to people when they are inspired by scientific facts and scientific recognitions by which they come to life again. The Ice Age challenge that lifts us out of our dreaming can have this effect. Ironically, very few people have any idea what gets us into the current Ice Age trap to begin with. Ice ages are quite rare on the Earth in the long sweep of the history of life on our planet. The climate that we have on Earth reflects the dynamics that affect our galaxy as a whole. What affects the energy climate in our galaxy is determined by the confluence of the resonance effects that occur in plasma streams that energize our galaxy. Contrary to general perception, galaxies are not self-existent and self-powered. They are powered by vast intergalactic plasma streams that flow through the galaxies. The intergalactic plasma streams flow between the galaxies in large plasma networks that pervade intergalactic space. The intergalactic plasma streams combine the galaxies into functionally interconnected cosmic structures. By plasma existing of electrically charged particles, the organized plasma streams have an internal resonance that is largely determined by their physical length. In the piano, for example, the tones of its sounds are determined in part by the length of its strings. Longer strings resonate at longer vibration cycles than shorter strings. The piano tones are typically measured in hundreds of cycles per second. In the cosmic environment, where the distance that separates the galaxies are enormously large, measured in the range of millions of light years. The electric resonance cycles that occur in the very long interconnecting plasma streams have correspondingly long resonance cycle times. While the piano tunes are measured in cycles per second, the intergalactic tones are measured in millions of years per cycle. The two resonance effects that affect our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, and thereby affect the Earth's climate, have been measured to be roughly 31 million years in duration for the short cycle and roughly 150 million years for the long cycles. The combination of the two resonance cycles is evident for Neozoic climate history on Earth, shown here. The graph covers the period of life on Earth going back in time 500 million years. One can see the two long climate cycles clearly evident in the physical measured long-term climate history on Earth. The Earth's climate history can be measured in ratios of a heavy isotope of oxygen, termed oxygen-18, in examples from historic times. The oxygen-18 isotope is an atom of oxygen that has two extra neutrons attached, which increases the weight of it. The difference in weight affects the rate of evaporation of the water molecules in which the oxygen is contained at different temperatures. The climate record that you see here is measured in oxygen-18 ratios that have been preserved in deep-sea sediments in the form of calcite shells produced by microorganisms. Since the calcium carbonate of the shells was formed by combining water and carbon dioxide from water, the organisms have locked into their shells the prevailing ratio of heavy oxygen at the time when the organism had lived. Since seawater molecules that contain heavy oxygen evaporate at different rates at different temperatures in comparison with normal water, the oxygen-18 ratio presents itself as a highly reliable proxy for measuring historic temperature patterns as far back in time as 500 million years. The existence of the 31 million year resonance cycle and the 150 million year resonance cycles has been discovered in this laboriously reconstructed climate record. The cause for the long cycles has been the object of much speculation until quite recently. At around 2010, when the data from NASA's Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope was analyzed, the existence of two gigantic structures was noted that was visible in gamma-ray light. The discovered structures extend above and below our galaxy, each spanning 25,000 light-years, the equivalent distance of half the radius of the galaxy itself. The geometry of the discovered large plasma structure associated with our galaxy is typical for the geometry observed in plasma stream node structures generated in laboratory experiments. The image shown here on the left was observed in plasma flow experiments conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the USA by Antonin Parrott. The experimentally derived forms reveal the existence of two large plasma confinement domes that magnetically contain high concentrations of plasma above and below the experimental node structure. The discovery of this same basic geometry on the galactic scale provides visible proof that our galaxy is not its own master, but exists at a node point between two intergalactic plasma streams, by which, in essence, the galaxy is powered, which in turn powers its roughly 400 billion stars within it, including our Sun as one of them. It has been long suspected that just as our Sun as a star exists at a node point in a string of interstellar plasma streams within the galaxy, by which the Sun is powered, in the same manner that all galaxies in the universe are powered by a common principle. As I said earlier, the relative distances of the two neighboring galaxies shown here as an example are all in the right proportions to create the 31 and 150 million years resonance cycles that we see in the climate record. NASA's discovery takes the theorized concept further out of the theoretical and places it into the realm of reality, for which proof now exists. It deserves to be repeated that the proof lies in the geometry of the discovered galactic structure, the geometry that has been discovered in the very large, extending above and below our galaxy, matches the geometry discovered in the very small, in high-energy plasma flow experiments conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. It proves that our galaxy is a part of a high-volume plasma flow structure. It also proves that the resonant density in the plasma streams that connect up with our galaxy is reflected throughout the galaxy and affects thereby the density of the plasma that powers all stars, including our Sun. These considerations prove that a roller coaster-like historic climate record on Earth has its origin in intergalactic space, with effects that affect the intensity of our Sun. This means that the historic climate record on Earth stands as a proxy for the cyclical variations in solar activity, which in turn are evident in the changing climate on Earth. The discoveries also prove that the principles that we see reflected in the climate record on Earth will continue to be expressed. And they are expressed in the Ice Age phenomena as a part of the expression of the changing galactic climate, reflected in a lawful manner. When we expand the last 50 million years of the long historic climate record, some rather dramatic effects come to light associated with some of the little downswings and upswings in the climate record. One effect that we see here is that Antarctica froze up roughly 35 million years ago, then thawed out again and froze up once more around 15 million years ago, and remained frozen thereafter, with the Earth's climate continuing to cool. Now, if we expand the last 5 million years of the climate record still further, we see that from a point on, enormously deep climate fluctuations began, and that these fluctuations are getting progressively larger. Here we see the beginning of what we call the Ice Ages. The dawn of humanity coincides closely with the startup of the Ice Ages. This fact is important, as I will later explain. For now, if one looks at the big climate history of the last 500 million years, one will note that the conditions at which the Ice Ages occur are quite rare in time. This tells us that the galactic environment for the Sun is presently at the weakest state it has been in 440 million years. The galactic environment has become so weak that the plasma density flowing into our solar system frequently drops below the threshold needed for plasma to be densely focused onto the Sun. The plasma compression around the Sun is accomplished by an electrodynamics process that forms primal fields for the concentration of plasma. When the dynamics are not achieved for the fields to form, the Sun falls back to a low-powered state that reflects the prevailing default level of plasma density in the solar system. At this point, under the low-powered Sun, deep glaciation conditions occur on Earth. If we look at only the tail end of this long train of ice ages, the one that we can also find embedded in the ice sheets of Antarctica, we encountered that the near extinction of humanity that archaeology believes to have occurred around 160,000 years ago coincides with the deepest and longest period of cold of the previous ice age. Archaeology sees evidence that the human population had dwindled from tens of thousands to just a few hundred, living in the caves at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, living off the sea. The event occurred during the last big dip on the benthic climate record, which records an exceptionally harsh ice age. While the event barely shows up on the long time scale, it does illustrate how fragile human existence is in the face of severe ice age conditions. If one expands that last portion where the dip occurred, and one looks at only the last 4 ice age cycles that we do have ice core records for from Antarctica, one notes that humanity's historic close call with extinction occurred during the deepest glaciation portion of the second last ice age. The better resolution of details that one gets from the ice cores indicates that the deep glaciation that nearly caused humanity to become extinct was followed by an extremely warm interglacial period, a much warmer period than the current one is. The resulting ideal conditions had probably enabled a massive recovery of humanity, with which it successfully weathered the last ice age, from which it emerged with a 1 to 10 million world population. Actually, the term success isn't a correct term for this. The low world population that survived the last ice age was more in the order of a tragedy. The minuscule 1 to 10 million world population was all that we had to show for after more than 2 million years of human development. This sparse population is not a reflection of the quality of humanity, but is a testament of the harshness of the Ice Age and the difficulty that humanity experienced in coping with it. From this minuscule startup population, from the end of the last Ice Age on, coming into the current interglacial period, the entire 7 billion world population developed that we now have. Everything that we have become, that we are and have achieved, the entire history of civilization was wrought into the time frame of that rightmost circle. This holiday from the cold is about to end sharply, possibly within 30 years. All of our history unfolded in that brief period of the current interglacial time frame of slightly less than 13,000 years in duration. Only the last portion of the interglacial period is shown here, where most of our history unfolded. The full interglacial period includes the building of the pyramids that may have been built 12,800 years ago. The climate record that is presented here, which includes oscillations going into the current interglacial period, and the highly magnified red one before, are reconstructed climate variations from ice data from the Greenland ice sheet. The Greenland ice gives us the best resolution of details because of the stronger snowfall on Greenland in comparison with Antarctica. Also note that the amount of precipitation reported during the end of the glacial period was 80% lower than what we have today. During the glacial times of a 70% weaker sun, the upper troposphere may have become a featureless veil of ice fog, shrouding the planet. This would have been the face of the Earth during the normal glacial climate. The familiar face of the Earth as we see it today, with many land features visible through the atmosphere, is the face of the Earth during the brief span of the interglacial anomaly, which too will likely be history soon. It is interesting to note that the development of written languages occurred quite late in the current interglacial time frame, and so did the development of the sciences. Also, the development of empires occurred in this period, and the development of wars, slavery, massacre, and oppressions. All that we know about the history of our civilization occurred in the current interglacial period, as if anything prior didn't exist. This lack of historic connection is understandable, because everything that happened before our interglacial anomaly happened in an entirely different world, a radically colder world with a dimmer sun and 80% less precipitation, so that only a few areas on the planet were able to support human populations, typically in small numbers near tropical rivers and seashores. This is the world we are getting back into with the Ice Age phase shift potentially happening in the 2050s. We face a totally different world at the moment when the Ice Age phase shift happens. We face a harsh world as we have never experienced before or even imagined before. Civilization freezes up at this hostile stage unless we enable it to continue with advanced technological infrastructures on a worldwide scale. But these take decades to build. Since we have only 30 years left, we better get started building soon. To wait is not an option. To wait means to fail. The transition time frame promises to be less than a single year. The critical time frame to start building for the future is now. Little was known throughout the entire period of the history of civilization that the climate that had enabled our remarkable civilization to develop is a rare, brief anomaly. Nor is it recognized even today that this anomaly, represented in the rightmost circle, is already collapsing again. The now ongoing collapse of our climate is so foreign in the context of historic experiences that its very happening is difficult to comprehend, even to imagine, even while the collapse has already begun and continues. The collapse began slowly at first, more than 3,000 years ago. We have now come to the end of that line. The collapse of the current interglacial sun is actually increasing. After the sun's upramping by the denser ice pulse that ended in the late 1900s, our interglacial sun is now so rapidly weakening, or actually collapsing towards the next ice age, that the phase shift to glaciation can be predicted to occur in the 2050s. We now have a 7 billion world population. This means that we face the awesome task to bring this large population successfully into the next deep glaciation period, which is a period of consequences that have never been experienced before in the entire history of civilization, and that we carry this large population all the way through the entire next glaciation cycle of 90,000 years in duration, and that we do this on a planet that by today's standard becomes largely uninhabitable, as the Earth becomes an ice planet by the unfolding cosmic dynamics. Since the challenge to live in a different world, such as we have never known before, which is by far the largest challenge in the entire history of humanity, remains carefully hidden from the world almost universally, especially from the sciences and from the governments. Our current chances for the collective survival of humanity are rather slim, or less than zero, unless we manage to wake ourselves up. To wake ourselves up is the frontline issue of today. To be or not to be hinges on that. The difficulty lies not in recognizing the physical evidence that should impel us, which is already evident everywhere. The difficulty lies in acknowledging it, because it is far easier to turn one's back to it and run away from the evidence and close one's eyes so not to see it, instead of having to deal with it. This is what is actually happening universally. Society has committed itself to fail. Modern society has become so short-sighted and small-minded that its future and its very existence is now threatened thereby. We face the kind of tragedy today that was hinted at in the Jonah allegory, that in the story even God had problems with in getting it addressed. It is unimaginable that no one in today's world in the advanced sciences should be unaware of the physical evidence of the near return of the glacial conditions and the ensuing consequences. The evidence is too strong for this to be possible. Humanity cannot be that densely stupid. God said to Jonah, "Go and talk with them, wake them up." But Jonah said no. The reason why we see no movement happening on this front in our time suggests that the Jonah syndrome still stands against us. It is far easier to close one's eyes and run away from the problem than to face reality and stir one's stumps into action to change the world of human living. A tiny bit of progress, however, has been made in the background over the last 50 years, and most of that has been made in the last 20 years. The application of carbon-14 ratios as a proxy for solar activity is relatively new. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope that is generated by solar cosmic ray flux interacting with nitrogen in the atmosphere. When the sun is strong, it has a dense plasma corona surrounding it, where a large portion of the cosmic rays are trapped. Consequently, the carbon-14 ratio is low on Earth. Inversely, when the sun is weak, the corona of the sun is weak also, and thereby fewer cosmic rays are trapped, and more reach the Earth, and a greater isotope ratio results. By measuring the ratio in historic samples, we can measure the intensity of the solar activity in historic time. The measurements proved that the sun was getting weaker towards the Little Ice Age in the 1600s, and that the global warming from the 1700s onward was caused by the cosmic upramping of the sun. All this is known. It is measured historic data. But who dares to stand in the hustings speaking of this profound fact, speaking against the politically motivated fairy tales? the hustings are empty. The few who would stand in them, if there are any, would have no support in our small-minded world, regardless of the immensity of the astrophysical fact and their future consequences for human living on an ice planet without infrastructures being built for them. And so the world remains asleep at the time of its greatest challenge to its very existence. The diminishing sunspot cycles that occurred in the 1970s prove that the solar up-ramping had ended and that the long-developing down-ramping is now back on the fast track. In the same time frame of the solar reversal in the 1970s, the NASA and ESO Ulysses mission was being prepared to measure the dynamics of the Sun outside the ecliptic space, where much cleaner measurements are possible that are not influenced by other factors. The mission was designed to observe the Sun from a wide polar orbit in order to measure its activity patterns in clean space, and to measure especially the solar wind speed, temperature, and density being emitted from the Sun. It took 20 years to get the mission planned and built and off the ground. Meanwhile, as the first Ulysses measurements were coming in, the first on-the-ground measurements were gathered that proved that the Earth was indeed in a cooling phase, as the diminishing sunspot numbers had indicated. The on-the-ground temperature measurements were reported by the Solar Terrestrial Institute in Irkutsk in southern Siberia. By the time the Ulysses satellite had completed its first orbit in 1998, its measurement had delivered supporting proof that the Sun was indeed getting weaker. In addition, Ulysses provided proof that our Sun is externally powered by electromagnetic primal fields focusing interstellar plasma streams onto the Sun, which cut through the flow of the solar wind over the poles. This measured evidence gives us a huge confirmation of the nature of the Sun as being externally powered by interstellar plasma flowing into it. By the time the Ulysses mission was terminated in 2008, it had delivered measured proof that the externally powered Sun is in a free-fall type of collapse. Ulysses had measured the Sun's vital solar wind pressure diminishing at a rate of 30% in 10 years. That's huge. This, too, is an enormously important discovery and measured evidence. Subsequent dynamic experiments in the time frame of the early 2010s in high-energy physics had begun to explore the nature of focused plasma streams and their corresponding evidence in space. Likewise, static experiments had been conducted to explore the physics of the discovered dynamic features. It was against this background, in 2010, that NASA's Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope revealed the two gigantic plasma structures that I had mentioned earlier, extending above and below our galaxy's center. The discovery adds significant measured evidence which renders the entire galaxy, like the Sun, an externally powered phenomenon responding to intergalactic resonances. The bottom line is that almost everything that we now know in terms of measured evidence about our galaxy, the solar system, and the ice ages on Earth didn't exist 20 years ago. When Milankovitch had theorized in the 1920s that ice ages on Earth are caused by the combined effect of variations in the eccentricity, axial shift, and precession of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, which he deemed to result in cyclical variations in the solar radiation reaching the Earth, he could not have known that he was hopelessly off the mark with his theory, because the fundamental discoveries of the real dynamics behind the Ice Age phenomena hadn't been made at this time, nor could these critical discoveries have been made at the time because the technologies did not exist then. Milankovitch literally worked in the dark and made mistakes. He failed to realize that the total energy received on Earth is always the same, regardless of the shifting and the orientation of its spin axis, which affects only hemispheric distribution. He also failed to recognize that Johannes Kepler had already proved in the 1600s that the total solar energy received on Earth remains the same, regardless of the shifting eccentricity of its orbit, which affects only seasonal distribution. Milankovitch failed primarily because he perceived the Sun to be an invariable constant, which modern measurements have proved to be the opposite, to be dramatically variable, and to be the actual driving cause for climate variations and the ice ages. If anyone had even succeeded in his time in the 1920s, what we know today, what really stands behind the Ice Age phenomenon, that person would have been ridiculed as a dreamer and would have been banished from the universities and relevant institutions. Sadly, the same is happening still. Actually, the lacking modern measurements had even hampered leading atmospheric scientists as late as 2003. Way back in time in the year 2003, Professor Dr. Zbigniew Jaworowski, a world-renowned atmospheric scientist and mountaineer, who had excavated ice out of 17 glaciers on 6 continents in a 50 years career, warned in his paper, The Ice Age is Coming, that according to the observed average duration of the warm periods between the ice ages, the end of the current warm period has already been exceeded by 500 years. But he didn't know why. The upramping of the Sun by a Dansgaard-Oeschger event hadn't been discovered. that had prevented the start of the next ice age potentially as early as the 1700s. The existence of the Dansker Øysker events hadn't been known until the North Greenland Ice Core project had been completed and analyzed, which happened several years after 2003. Neither had a fast rate of the diminishing solar wind pressure been measured yet by the Ulysses spacecraft. This hadn't been known until 2008. All that Jaworowski could point out in his 2003 paper was that a transition to the next ice age is near and may have already started, and had been able to warn that the phase shift between the cold and warm climate phases is dramatically short. He suggests that the transition phase may be as short as 50 years, or 20, or just 1 year, and that a phase shift to the next ice age can start virtually without warning. He merely guessed on this forecast because the relevant data hadn't been available at that time. Now that the data has been measured, more accurate forecasts are possible with the authority based on concrete facts. The breakthrough discoveries are all denied today. The evidence lays buried. The achievements are hushed, as if they had never happened. People go out of their way not to see them, so that they won't have to touch the subject, because if they did touch it, they would have to acknowledge to themselves that it is really up to them to get involved, to let go of their dreaming and put the spade into the ground to change the world in which we live, to change it in accord with what must be achieved for humanity to be able to exist and flourish on the coming ice planet in 30 years, according to the available evidence that we have. The difference between Milankovich's time and ours is that in the 1920s the Ice Age issue hadn't been critical. Now, almost 100 years later, the issue has become existentially critical, because if the issue isn't understood soon and the Ice Age consequences are not prepared for by humanity creating itself a new world with high-level technological infrastructures, which are not even envisioned today, then 99% of humanity will perish by starvation when the Ice Age phase shift begins. In the Jonah allegory, Jonah is poked and poked again by God till he finally gets his act together and does what he should have done in the beginning. We in the world have not come to this point yet. This means that the time has come for humanity to wake itself up. Also, I should add that if we should manage to wake us up as human beings, then not even the sky will be a limit for what we can accomplish. As I have suggested many times in relevant exploration videos, it is possible for the whole of humanity to relocate itself into the tropics before the Ice Age begins. For this, roughly 6,000 new cities for 1,000,000 people each will need to be built, together with new agricultures operating with artificial enhanced climates and new industries to surface it all. And all of this being placed afloat across the equatorial seas, where fresh water and CO2 for agriculture can be drawn directly from the oceans. Large-scale deep ocean reverse osmosis desalination is possible that utilizes the weight differential between fresh water and seawater to drive the process by itself. The process would cause rivers of fresh water to flow out of the oceans, and likewise large volumes of CO2 by the same principle to sustain agriculture. Ice core samples indicate that atmospheric CO2 is dramatically reduced during glaciation conditions, so that artificial CO2 enhancement will be needed on a large scale in order for efficient agriculture to be possible. We are presently at the lowest point in CO2 concentration in the entire history of life. We are barely above the biological starvation level. For efficient agriculture, the CO2 concentration needs to be uplifted. Some greenhouse operators artificially double it and get a 50% increase in plant growth with it. We cannot afford to let the critical CO2 level drop to the level of the previous ice ages, the 200 mark, where plant growth almost stops. Of course, the CO2 uplift during glacial conditions, together with desalination, requires large-scale infrastructures and large-scale industries to build the infrastructures. It requires an industrial revolution on a scale that has never before been seen or even imagined before, built with new materials, new energy systems, new high-temperature industrial automation, and a new approach to science and technology itself. The new material for the Ice Age Industrial Revolution is basalt. Basalt is a stone of extremely fine grain that melts at 1700 degrees, whereby it can be reshaped into anything that one cares to imagine. It is stronger than steel, lighter, and is non-corrosive. It exists in near infinite abundance, process-ready, sitting on the ground. Almost all of the new infrastructures can be built with it, such as the floating cities and floating agricultures. Basalt can also be extruded into microfibers that can be woven into glass, such as large-scale arteries for worldwide water distribution networks laid afloat onto the oceans, with floating reservoirs fed with the outflow of the Amazon River, the Congo River, and the like, which would still be substantial rivers, even when global precipitation diminishes by 80% during glaciation conditions. The outflow of these rivers would then be used to bring the lifeblood of civilization to the water-starved ice-free continents that otherwise would become uninhabitable. Large-scale deep ocean reverse osmosis desalination would, of course, also augment the river-fed worldwide freshwater distribution system. On the continents, the delivered fresh water would be pumped to wherever it would be needed via continent-wide water distribution pipeline systems. With these technological systems, civilization would continue unabated and would develop forevermore, while without them only a few people would have a chance to survive with a primitive type of existence. The high-temperature process heat for melting basalt to produce the needed infrastructures can be easily provided with the liquid fluoride nuclear fission reactor, similar to that of the type shown here. Advanced types are now being considered that utilize liquid lead as the primary heat carrier. Such reactors might produce the 1400 degrees process heat for basalt processes directly from the nuclear reaction. The boiling point of lead is well above the 1400 degrees process temperature. To date, high-temperature systems that generate process heat in the range of 1000 degrees are already contemplated. In this case, the process heat would need to be pumped up slightly for the processing of basalt. The advanced liquid fuel nuclear reactor, in addition, has the potential to be so efficient that a single ton of reactor fuel would produce close to the theoretical limit in energy equivalent, equal to burning 50 million tons of coal. The liquid-fueled nuclear reactor is able to burn any type of nuclear fuel, from thorium all the way to weapons plutonium and nuclear waste products. As for thorium, there exist 1.8 million tons of it in known deposits in the world, and probably more than that. In other words, our energy future looks bright if we care to develop it. The process of creating the Ice Age infrastructures for our continued living on this planet would create still a further energy revolution, such as the world has never seen. And we do need a big energy revolution. Our current energy production infrastructure is so archaic that it will need to be scrapped in the near future for the lack of resources. Coal, gas, and oil are consumable resources that have largely been already depleted. Then what? Some people even dream about nuclear fusion power as the energy source for the future. But this dream is already failing for the simple reason that the concept doesn't work. It is not supported by universal principles. The fusion of atoms into larger atoms is an energy-consuming process. No sun in the universe is powered by such a process. The big splash of fire of a hydrogen bomb explosion is not primarily produced by the fusion of two atoms, but is produced by the fissioning of a neutron from an overbuilt atomic isotope. The neutron's binding energy is released thereby when the neutron becomes unbound. The process works well for the hydrogen bomb because the bomb is triggered with an atomic fission bomb that causes a lot of isotopes to fuse simultaneously and unwind their excess neutrons. Nor does it matter how much energy needs to be invested to produce the overbuilt isotopes for making the bomb. Also, the overbuilt isotopes don't exist naturally. They need to be created. These factors make controlled nuclear fusion power an unrealizable dream. Nor is the process utilized by the sun. No exclusive evidence exists that the sun is powered by nuclear fusion happening at its core. This is simply a dream. Are we running out of options then for an energy-rich future? Let's put this into perspective. We have lived for 3 million years on this planet. Our civilization has developed in the last 6,000 years. Our large-scale energy utilization began only 200 years ago. In this very short period, the resource depletion was so extensive that at the current rate of burning, standard nuclear fuel will be used up in 60 years, oil may be used up in 100 years, and maybe coal in 200 years. Even for the most efficient nuclear power reactor, the liquid-fueled reactor, the world fuel supply won't last us more than 10,000 years till it is depleted. Whatever the actual limits may turn out to be, one thing is certain: the world is running out of energy resources, while civilization has just barely begun. The next ice age will last all by itself for 90,000 years. For this we need extra energy, not less. Also, there will be dramatically less conventional resources available. Large portions of the current used coal, oil and gas resources become inaccessible during the glaciation climate. Hydroelectric power, of course, will cease for the lack of water in the atmosphere to drive them. Solar and wind power will likewise cease. This means that we need to look to space and learn to utilize the cosmic energy resource that actually power our sun and the universe, which is a resource that cannot be depleted. All the evidence that does exist, and exists in many forms, points to the sun being externally powered by plasma fusion reactions occurring on its surface, with interstellar plasma streams being densely focused onto it. And this is our salvation. Without it, we would have a dead-end energy crisis. A high-level civilization that needs to support a large population cannot exist without large-scale energy systems, whether we live in an ice planet Earth or in an interglacial holiday from the ice, as we presently do. Our salvation is that the plasma streaming in space that powers the sun is also available to the Earth. In fact, it is already powering every large planetary electric phenomena, such as lightning, tornadoes, and hurricanes. The plasma streams in space are not a consumable resource. They are forever self-renewing by the principles that power the galaxies and the universe. Isn't that what the Jonah legend hints at? When a world responds to its humanity, to its created resources, it creates itself a feast of a renaissance of such proportions that it would be a feast for the heart to behold its splendor. Should it fail on this count, its fate is doom. This challenge will never go away. Just as the demand on Jonah could not be sidestepped or be escaped from, so the Ice Age challenge cannot be sidestepped or be escaped from. No other choice exists than to meet that challenge, or to commit suicide, which isn't really an option for humanity. Thus, the Ice Age challenge will poke at us until the challenge is met. It appears that the stage is already set, where the options not to respond to the Ice Age challenge doesn't really exist. It also appears that the universe will help us on that count, inasmuch that the stage is supported by the universe itself. As the Ice Age dynamics unfold, the already rapid increase in solar cosmic ray flux promises to increase society's cognitive power. Cosmic rays are not rays in the standard sense. They are single events of fast-moving plasma particles. Each person on Earth encounters typically 50,000 cosmic ray events per day. The particles being several 100,000 times smaller than the atoms of our biology. The particles pass right through us without colliding with anything. However, as they pass through us, by them carrying an electric charge, their movement creates a minute electric current in the body by electromagnetic induction. The induction appears to be beneficial for our complex neurological processes that operate largely electrically. Historic evidence points into this direction. It is a fact of history that the great cultural advances in civilization have typically occurred during cold times, that are times of greater volumes of solar cosmic ray flux reaching the Earth. The dawn of written languages occurred in such a time, as did the dawn of Christianity, the Golden Renaissance, and the dawn of the sciences and great classical culture. Inversely, the victory periods of empire, riddled with wars, massacres, and destruction, such as the Roman period, the Dark Age medieval period, occurred in times of low volumes of solar cosmic ray flux. According to measured isotope ratios in ice core samples, the largest volume of solar cosmic ray flux occurred in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the period of the weakest sun. In this time frame, the greatest modern cultural achievements in the sciences were wrought, and in music, literature, politics, and economics. In the Maunder minimum period of the 1600s and early 1700s, the great geniuses emerged, such as the musical geniuses Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and also revolutionary scientists and artists, and also genius politicians. Inversely, at the high point of the solar up-ramping, when the sun was the strongest and the cosmic reflux the weakest, the weak solar cosmic reflux coincides with the modern World War period and the start of the Cold War. With the sun now rapidly weakening, we are leaving the cosmically lean times fast behind us, in which the modern empires had flourished and insanity and war had ruled, and we are moving back into the cosmically rich times in which humanist culture has historically flourished. In other words, the age of empires is over, without recourse. Like a stranded jellyfish, the systems of empire are drying up on the beach. The return of the humanist age is dawning. In this dawn, it is safe to move forward with our bright cultural heritage from the past that we already have and advance it further, so that humanity will at length have their joy in the greatest renaissance of all times that the Ice Age challenge inspires, and the increasing solar cosmic reflux will help facilitate, which is about to become reality on the earth with a high degree of certainty, possibly with the same high degree of certainty with which the Ice Age phase shift itself will happen, that is already on the fast track, speeding ahead. Of course, the largest increase will happen after the phase shift to glaciation takes place. We are not at a phase shift yet, nor has the recognition yet been made that there will be a phase shift, but a silent start has been made. We still have a long way to go yet. We are not even out of the woods until the Ice Age recognition is universally made. The little unresolved issues, like the nuclear weapons issues, uranium war issues, economic collapse issues, terror and slavery issues, and so on, will continue to plague us even while they wane. They may yet tear our house down, though with lesser likelihood. While we still have a long way to go on this path, it can be said, however, that the end of the modern political nightmare is already far advanced, and that the dawn already looks encouragingly bright. The time when the transition is made in society to acknowledge the Ice Age challenge, which in its course ushers the systems of empire that dominate humanity off the stage, depends on the love that humanity brings to light from its heart for one another as human beings, and its love for the truth and for its life, and for itself as a species of a profound mind. Without humanity developing its universal love, its trust in truth, its joy in life, and the sparkle of its mind, humanity remains in danger to fall on the steep grade of the Ice Age challenge. But why should humanity fail to make the grade? We have the greatest resources on hand to win on this front that humanity ever had developed for itself in its entire history. China appears to be already moving in the direction of considering its future on the coming ice planet Earth. And with China starting to move, can the rest be far behind? China appears to be moving on this front because it doesn't have the deeply debilitating system of empire hanging around its neck. It has become a free state. On the basis of its unfolding freedom, China has built itself the fastest developing economy in the world. While this process is still at the beginning stage, it has already the potential to inspire the world to follow its lead. On this path, the end of empire is near. No Jonah is needed to inspire empire to disband itself. It simply remains left behind on the road of progress, where it dries up like a stranded jellyfish on a sunny beach. Once the astrophysical climate dynamics are becoming more universally recognized and understood, and the powerful Renaissance solutions become experienced, everyone will want to be on the bandwagon for freedom, the freedom from debt, money, limitations, crime, war, looting, slavery, and so on. In the light of the freedom from empire, wars become unthinkable and are left behind in the dust to rot. Even the Glass-Steagall law for a secure banking system that empires fear more than the plague will become implemented along the way and be superseded and then be left behind in the dust likewise on the road of further progress. The now ongoing transition to an Ice Age Earth will affect everything. It will change everything. It will get us to where we need to be before all the lands on the earth become rapidly uninhabitable by the cold and by the lack of water. Us, knowing this, will draw the whole of humanity together for a common grand purpose to create a new world and a new renaissance for a new future that no one can create alone, but which must be created now, in our time, to be ready when we require it, because the Ice Age does not wait. Nor will the rule of the nation diminish on this wide scene of global development. It will become redefined by the value of its contribution to the success of the whole. The stage for this new world is already developing under China's pioneering Belt and Road Initiative. On this unfolding platform, the nations have already begun to work with each other in multiple bonds of cooperative endeavors for building each other up. What we see here comes to light as a natural step towards building the kind of world together that the Ice Age cannot touch. Mastering the Ice Age challenge is the biggest issue in today's world by far. That's what lays before us, whether we care to acknowledge this or not. No other issue is greater in potential and consequences. All other issues are little issues in comparison, and will dry up on the beach together with the systems of empire. In many respects, we haven't even begun to awake. To awake from a long sleep is an unfolding process. The allegory of Jonah deals with the process of humanity awakening. The allegory of Jonah is actually more fitting for our time. The story doesn't match actual history of the time that it refers to. In actual historic time, Nineveh was not saved. It was utterly destroyed in 612 BC. Its population was massacred. The destruction was so devastating that the place was not repopulated. The once great pearl of antiquity had simply ceased to exist. The hope of God in the allegory of Jonah to save the city of Nineveh and its inhabitants evidently was not realized. The Jonah, who according to the story would have spoken to the rulers of the Assyrian Empire, requesting them to repent and disband the entire empire system and their glory with it, most likely never existed as a real person. Had he existed, and had he succeeded in getting the empire to disband itself, the city would have remained intact, and the people would have remained alive. As it was, an alliance of the vassals of the empire was formed, for them gaining their freedom from it. The allied forces attacked the empire and destroyed its capital city, and massacred its people. This fate, by principle, was built into the empire system itself. Every empire defeats itself on its founding platform. But should the fate of Nineveh be the fate of our time? Should the fate of the people be the fate of humanity? In historic time, 3 years after the eradication of Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist. The former vassals recovered and lived again. The building of today's Ice Age infrastructures cannot possibly be achieved under the currently operating systems of empire. What had not been achieved in the Jonah story must be achieved in our time, for the original reason and for one additional reason that has become extremely critical. In historic time, the masters of empire had ruled only the lands and the people living in their domain. In modern time, the masters of empire also rule the sciences and the thinking of the people, which prevents the Ice Age challenge from being recognized. The scientific papers that successfully passed the chain link fence of the politically correct censorship process, termed peer review, won't contain anything truthful, much less anything related to the greatest scientific challenge in the history of civilization, which is the Ice Age challenge. Nowhere in the top-down controlled world, from the system's newspapers to its magazines and its televisions, is a single word ever being published that an Ice Age is near, with consequences that render our world uninhabitable. Much less do any of the media note that the first phase of the transition towards the next Ice Age is already half complete and is progressing. Nowhere is it even hinted at in modern empire-owned publications, including scientific publications, that the Ice Age challenge exists and can be met with the building of vast technological infrastructures and that a vast new renaissance will be inevitable when the building begins. The potential for such a great renaissance remains hidden today, because if it became known, then the entire pyramid of the systems of empires would lose its foundation to exist. For this reason, the Renaissance potential remains deeply hidden for the protection of empire. By the very principle of its existence, empire exists as a looting machine, looting humanity, rather than aiding humanity to build itself a new entire world. This building won't be happening, for as long as the golden coach still inspires fascination, rather than the recognition that it is but a pumpkin. It would have been a miracle if Jonah would have actually succeeded in getting empire to forsake its tradition by which it exists and to disband itself. The principle of empires is fascism and terror, by which it maintains its illegitimate existence. It always has been that. Jonah would have stood against that tradition. Would a Jonah have dissuaded Napoleon? The French Empire under Napoleon, that had been self-defeated in Russia, was ultimately defeated in the same manner that Nineveh was defeated, by society waking up, reaching for freedom, for a chance to live again. Jonah would have read about the conquests of the Assyrian Empire, written on large stone tablets set up in Nineveh, as a bold testament of the crimes of its empire, with scenes of many battles, scenes of impalings of people, and scenes of showing men parading the spoils of war before their king. The inscriptions boasted of the conquests. The king wrote about Babylon. Its inhabitants, young and old, I did not spare, and with their corpses I filled the streets of the city. Upon reaching such boastings, Jonah would have had to say to the rulers of the empire, "This is why your empire will fail, one way or another. You are self-defeated by your deeds. You live on borrowed times. Repent, disband the empire, and live." If Jonah had said this, he would have been cast out for speaking treason. The same applies to the modern systems of empire. The very existence of humanity is an affront to its masters that society hails, which opens the gate to massacres. By the achievements in Dresden, World War II was lost the second time. The massacre of 500,000 people in this city, which had no military significance, was not an act of war, but a demonstration of the post-war New World Order. And this defeat was just the beginning. What took, in the case of Dresden, more than 1,000 heavy bombers to accomplish in the space of 14 hours of endless seeming unimaginable barbarism, was a short time later accomplished repeatedly with only a single device and for the same purpose. In Hiroshima, humanity lost World War II for the third time around. It became a defeated society. Humanity became so deeply self-defeated that it now faces a worldwide nuclear arsenal with a destructive power of 500,000 Hiroshima bombs deployed against it in the war of empire against humanity. The value of the human being has been so deeply discounted below zero that the empire-mandated biofuels production now consumes agricultural resources at a volume that would normally nourish 400 million people. In a world that has 1 billion people living in chronic starvation, the crime of the mass burning of food on such a vast scale as we now have it, adds up to an ongoing massacre of 100 million people by intention, by policy, silently, year after year. And what is worse, vast segments of humanity are actively engaged in committing this massacre by exploitation at the gas pump. This is done willingly, without as much as raising an eyebrow. Where are the Jonahs standing in the hustings in our time, speaking for sanity? Here lies the greatest challenge, the challenge to break the barriers that prevent us from meeting the Ice Age challenge. The infrastructures for securing the future existence of humanity past the Ice Age phase shift can easily be built. The materials, technologies, and energy resources all exist. But the object for whom the infrastructures would be built has been devalued to far below zero in the eyes of humanity itself in the modern age, the age of empire that has not yet ended. Humanity is still laying itself down to die, even while it would live. This is where the barrier lies against humanity giving itself a future. This is why the Ice Age challenge remains a hidden issue. This is why it is rendered a non-issue. If humanity succeeds in raising itself up out of the sewer of its gross self-devaluation, to seeing itself as the greatest asset in the world, second to none, and sees itself with love universally for what it is, then we have a chance to come out of the Ice Age crisis, a crisis that presently almost no one recognizes to even exist, and come out of it with a renaissance that becomes the brightest renaissance of all times, a renaissance without empire, without war, terror, looting and destruction, and with an endless future for all humanity. We will know that the time has come to roll the drums and pull the cork off the champagne bottle, when we will see modern Jonahs standing in the hustings in great masses worldwide, speaking in choruses excitingly about building a new world, about building thousands of new cities afloat on the seas, rent-free, and hear talks about free universal education, transportation, healthcare, food, and the freedom to develop. Then, it appears, the gate is open to celebration, because by these commitments the future is golden. I think we will get there.